Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
I'm joined this morning by Phil Kearney. It is Kearney, isn't it, Phil?
It is, yeah.
It is, yes.
You're doing better than 80% of the UK population right there.
They want to call you Kearney, don't they?
That's the one. There's a real fight against it. There's a suggestion that I've been saying my name wrong for many, many years, and they try and correct me on it straight away.
So, anyway, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Talent Equation Podcast. It's great to have you here.
It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a definite honour.
Well, we've obviously been in touch over the years, usually in the Twitter sphere, as is often the case, and then we were we bumped into each other at ESAN. Is that right?
Yeah.
Would
have been at some point.
Yeah, I remember seeing you there. The Skill Acquisition Network, and then obviously it was great to kind of formalize the acquaintance, if you like. And when I was over in Cork with your colleagues, Ed and Olly and Alan. For the Movement Skill Acquisition Ireland conference, which was fantastic, and obviously ever since I've been really keen to try and have a conversation with you in this format. But it would be useful as a starting point, I guess, just to tell everybody a bit about yourself and what you do and what your kind of background is as far as working in the whole coaching and skill act space.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of, as a lot of your guests have talked about, the kind of the early background being a multi-sport background and being engaged in lots of different activities. That's kind of where I come from as well. I come from one of four siblings, an older brother who's only 1 year older, having access to back gardens, having access to local parks, a bit of scrubland behind the house. And so I'm kind of very much aware of a lot of my attitudes and my opinions when it comes to youth development is biased by those what I think were really positive experiences, but also needing to be very careful about, I'm not mixing up what's familiar to me with what's most effective. So that's kind of the general background in terms of where I started off and got me interested in sport. I went off to university not knowing what exactly it is I wanted to do. I had an interest in science and I had an interest in sport as well. So I combined the two of those to study sports science. And in the final 18 months really of that degree, I came across applying skill acquisition. So I was involved in track and field myself, and I was applying it to myself. There's a couple of more incidents where I saw, skill acquisition is a really powerful thing, and it sparked a passion in me at that point. And so from there, it really just kicked off. I wanted to get into the research side of things. Applied for funding a few different times. Eventually got one, and did my PhD looking at children's fundamental movement skills. So I was interested in looking to see how, rather than what I was seeing as the very standard prescriptive way of teaching fundamental movement skills, which is lots of direct instruction and lots of modeling specific patterns, whether some of these ideas that were coming about in motor learning or skill acquisition could be applied. So playing around with constraints and stumbling across an early paper by Wolfgang Schallhorn on differential learning and thinking, okay, that could be fun to apply to children's fundamental movement skills. So that was kind of my first aspect of studying skill acquisition. And then I was lucky enough to get a position in the University of Chichester. So Chichester has a very long history in skill acquisition. I suspect as much skill acquisition as you'll find in any university degree in the UK. And so there, it just broadened my understanding of skill acquisition. I moved away from fundamental movement skills because of the nature of the courses that I was teaching on over there. And my research changed to look at things like Gabrielle Wolf's focus of attention type work, or learning how to learn. So this idea of skillful learners. How do we help people to become more skillful at learning to allow them to become more skillful footballers or cricketers or whatever the case may be? And while I was there as well, I had a couple of injuries which stopped me from competing so much. And I started coaching with a local athletics club, and had some fantastic experiences with that. That drove me to take on the program coordinator role of the sports science and coaching program. And then what I was seeing when I was working with the athletes, what I was seeing at competitions, the interactions I had with parents, again, that just changed my view as to what I wanted to research, because I'm in a very fortunate position of, my hobby is my job, effectively. I get to research the things that are particularly relevant to me, and if I wasn't working in lecturing, then I would be trying to do this in my spare time. So I am incredibly fortunate to be able to apply that. And some conversations with parents in particular sparked this new line of research that I'm on, which is about what the environment is like in which young track and field athletes develop and how we optimize that. And so I was in Chichester for 8 years, really enjoyed that. And then decided we'd come back to Ireland. So jumped across, I picked up a little bit of teaching in UL, as you said. The other big thing has been taking a phone call from Ed Coughlan. So Ed and Olly had met at the Kisicalio conference, which is a really fantastic Skill Act conference. They had the idea of forming a group, of holding an international conference where they were going to bring in the best speakers from around the world that they could think of in the area of ecological dynamics in particular for the starting point. And for me, I guess that's a bit like, if you're familiar with the Blues Brothers, that's a bit like taking a call from Jake and Elwood Blues and saying, we're putting the band together. Do you want to get involved? There's only one answer that you can make there. So yeah.
That analogy is going to hold so well now.
But yeah, so and that was an extraordinary conference. All the conversations building up to it, all the conversations since, the things that has kicked off. So we've got our work to do now to try and keep building awareness of skill acquisition and how it can be applied, and how it can help athletes, how it can help coaches, how it can help clubs, and really keen just to grow that in Ireland now. So yeah, that's a few bits of background. Hopefully you'll find enough things there to pick on and to build off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in obviously there's a lot of things I think that we both share interest in. I wouldn't mind just taking you back really to the stuff you did around fundamental movement skills, because with Richard Cheetham, who was on the show last week, a lot of his research focuses on that and but using sort of like purposeful play, I suppose, as a means by which to support the development of movement skills. Your background, similar to mine, and I think there's lots of us out there, lamenting the demise of informal, child-centered exploratory play experiences, going into the woods and coming back all scraped and bruised. Some of my favorite childhood memories, creating dens and bows and arrows and all sorts of things. So all of that background definitely colors my view of, certainly childhood, certainly play, certainly, kind of the development of problem solving skills and movement and all those sorts of things. So I'd be interested just to sort of, where did you arrive at with that with that study and with that research, and kind of what are your views now as you sort of move through the whole skill acquisition landscape and we get a deeper and better understanding of the various things that are out there? has things changed, or are you still fundamentally bought into the same conceptual ideas?
Well, I think what exactly fundamental movement skills are is, and defining that, I think that's been brewing for a while as a discussion point. And it kicked off recently. There was a really nice video where a Portuguese group came along and said, this traditional view of run, jump, throw, skip, that's not good enough. It doesn't capture the full wide range of skills. And when it comes to assessing these things, so this is your most proficient way to throw a ball. I said, well, actually, throwing happens in 1,000 different ways. Skipping can potentially happen in 1,000 different ways. So I think one of the first really productive discussions that's happening in the literature, and that's going to eventually make its way into coaching practice, is redefining what fundamental movement skills are, and coming up with promoting greater understanding of the variation of movement that's important, and the adaptability of movement that's important. I think one of my favorite exercises for some students that I was working with this year on fundamental movement skills, you engineer these situations. So I deliberately forgot some marker pens for the boards that we were going to work on. So I called in the group and I said, look, I've forgotten my pens. I need to go out of the room for 5 minutes to walk to the office, come back and get there. We're going to do some stuff on skipping today. When I come back, I would like you to be able to demonstrate 1,000 different skills. To which there was a kind of a shock and a deadpan silence. And, I said, yeah, 1,000 different ways you can skip, because that now we're moving in towards the notion of adapting movements and being able to perform this action in different ways and through different variations. And that's, I think, the key if we're going to try to get some transfer out of these skills. So it's not just a restricted small set of movements. We've really got to build a very broad set of movement skills, which have lots of variations within each movement as well. So I think that holds true to what I had been doing in the study when I was doing my PhD, whereas it was about a very low variability practice. So we've got one target, one projectile, one distance. We were working on throwing in particular. So I described it at the time as an artificially low variability kind of environment, because if you let kids loose to play, then there will be variability in there. There may not be as much variability as there should, but there will be, as is most beneficial for learning, but there will be some variability. And I think one of the dangers with primary school and coaches with large numbers, they try and control too much. And when you try and control too much, you reduce variability, you reduce variation. And so you lose a lot of the variation that promotes adaptability. And so the other groups that I was comparing that low variability group to was a kind of a formalized variability group. So you would throw to 3 different targets and 3 different distances and 3 different angles at which the targets were located. And then I had a Wolfgang Schulhorn inspired group, which was you're going to do some random movements involved in each of the throws. And we structured how we do the random movements. So we used a hula hoop, for instance, and you had to throw with different feet in or out of the hula hoop, and 1 foot or 2 foot on the ground, and ball starting in different locations, but just to ramp up the variability as much as possible. And it was pretty obvious for me. One of my big take-home messages when I walked out of that was one of these groups I think had a lot more fun than the other.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's kind of an important bit. And I also straight away, when I was doing the pilot testing, the teachers had a preference for one of those groups, and it wasn't necessarily the one that the children were enjoying more either, because you had this trade-off between discipline and chaos, really. But I think a lot of the good learning comes from that chaos, if you can harness it and channel it appropriately. Although it also could be the fact that I would go into the school, wind the children up for 45 minutes and then hand them back to the teacher. So that might also have been part of the reason why the teachers were less keen on that aspect of my session.
So just digging into that a little bit more, because that's some fascinating, probably unintentional findings, I suppose. But just in terms of the experimental design, I'm particularly interested in this because I've got myself embroiled in a Twitter debate today, which I said I wasn't going to do, but just talking about things like, the value of qualitative research versus quantification of complex adaptive movements, et cetera. Anyway, but I just think what's interesting is did you have any findings in terms of, so you got three groups, you've got like a control group that are doing what you might call the traditional, quite reductionist approach of low variability movements.
Yeah, and deliberately excessive reductionist. So I had a middle group, which is probably more normal, but I had a really low,
right,
really reductionist approach, a really high on the opposite end, and a middle group as well.
But the task was the same.
The fundamental task was throwing.
Yeah.
Again,
okay.
we mixed in other fundamental movement skills around that. So they were getting a wide range of skills, but the one we were measuring and concentrating on was throwing.
And in terms of throwing, what were you measuring? Were you measuring accuracy? Were you measuring power? Were you measuring efficiency? What were you looking at in throwing?
So the two things that we were looking at speed as kind of an outcome measure, and then there is a kind of a measure of if you're going to throw a ball as far as possible. There's some very nice validated. This is the proficient movement pattern. And when I say proficient, again, we're not talking about a high skill movement pattern. This is the 40% pass rate that all children should be capable of achieving. It's not, and it's the simple things. You're stepping with the opposite foot. There is a contribution from the trunk. The arm is lagging behind the trunk. So it's not complicated things. But we did some video analysis of that as well. So everything in this was about, and again, it wasn't throwing, because throwing is a skill that you use in a million different ways, from throwing a cricket ball on a pitch from loads of different angles to throwing a rescue bag on a river if you're in an adventure sport context. So what throwing looks like is very different. This was geared towards the kind of throwing for distance type fundamental throw.
And you had low variability, what you might call moderate or medium variability, and then very high variability groups.
That was the goal with it, yeah.
And what were the findings?
So this is the joys of doing real world research. Okay. Ireland has a very temperate climate.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah, go on.
We don't get extremes at the moment. This is
unprecedented.
This last couple of weeks. In my lifetime, Ireland has never experienced anything like this.
I have to say, just by the way, while we're on weather, because obviously we like talking about that, I'm the same, right? I can't remember a summer period of continuous sunshine since literally me being the age of about 10. I mean, it's been that long. But
you see, I've got this automatic block when I talk to an English person about the weather, because when I moved over to Chichester, I was walking around in a shirt, and there might have been a little bit of drizzle, kind of a sun shower, but I was thinking this is an amazing summer, and everybody around me was complaining about this being the worst summer ever. And then I checked it out, because I'm back on the west coast of Ireland now, and I checked it out, and I know Chichester is a sunnier part of England, but on average, I've got 100 days more rain per year now where I am compared to Chichester. So I do have this mental block when I come to talking to English people about the weather, and a kind of what's that line in the Game of Thrones? You know nothing, Jon Snow. There's a kind of there's a different experience on this side of it.
And Rob Gray, who's over there in Arizona, hasn't got a clue what we're talking about.
He isn't. Just other world altogether. So weather. So I did my testing, and I did my short-term retention testing just before Christmas, and that was showing some signs that maybe the high variability group is a little bit better, but we wouldn't expect to be a major difference right there. We'd expect the long-term retention to be the key one. So I then left them over Christmas break, because they hadn't been doing anything. They weren't going to be doing a huge amount of activity. Ireland doesn't have a lot of throwing sports.
Yeah,
tennis isn't a particularly big game over here, so I was fairly safe that they weren't going to get a huge amount of throwing. They came back to school in January. I tested them then again. I had my nice long retention period. One of the 2 or 3 years in 20, it snowed, and snowed heavily. So these kids were having snowball fights.
Yeah.
All over the Christmas period, or there was certainly a 2-week block. So suddenly my carefully controlled experiment, it lost some of that careful control. So the results still came out that a slight suggestion that maybe the high variability group had been a little bit better, but not major differences. But the other thing that I think influences that is that when we look at children's fundamental movement skills, and you can look at studies going back 20 years longer, you can look at studies all different countries, children aren't mastering these basic skills. That's a consistent message that we're getting. Actually, a lot of these kids, their skills were so poor, any kind of exposure was leading to improvement. So actually, it didn't matter so much whether it was the low variability, the high variability, any kind of exposure was leading to an improvement. So I think that's, that was an important kind of consideration to have as well. But actually, when I reflected back on it, and this links to your point about, the importance of careful control in experiments. And we do want careful control, and we do have to have an element of that. But there's a difference between an experiment to discover the mechanisms behind something and an intervention which is going to be effective. So there's an Australian researcher, I think Jan Peek, described this animal games type intervention that they did down in Australia. This is a good 10 years ago now. But they were at an interview with some of the parents afterwards, finding out some more information about how it went down. And one of the parents said, or one of the teachers said, the parents came in saying, "What have you been teaching my children about fleas? My son is now walking around the house, and I've got neighbors or guests in the house, and he's talking about fleas the whole time, catching fleas and throwing them away." And it turns out one of the animal games was, so the child would reach behind his or her shoulder or neck and scratch about and go, "Monkey finds a flea," and throws it away. And so this was the imagery that was associated with throwing. And they had imagery associated with kangaroos and bouncing, and elephants and balancing walk, and all sorts of different animals. And I thought to myself, forget the careful controlled experiments, that's what we're missing. What we really want, if we want a successful intervention, we want something that is so appealing that the children will take it and incorporate it into their outside play. And once they do that, we can't control for it anymore. We can't measure it very well anymore. But actually, as an intervention, that's exactly what you want. You want to inspire them to take this and make it part of their everyday play. So that was another one of the kind of big reflections that I had coming out of this. That's the way we need to move towards for interventions, because we never have enough time in club sessions. We never have enough time in school PE sessions. It's always got to be inspiring people to do more outside of the context.
So that's there's a number of things there. I was just thinking as you was talking about that I guess initially when you're an enthusiastic PhD student and you've got big aspirations to test your hypothesis around fundamental movements, that when you come out with what is ostensibly a bit of a kind of wishy-washy finding, it's all very disappointing. However, you have just not stumbled, you've deliberately taken me into a place which I was quite keen to go, which is you had an observational finding which probably wasn't intentional within the experiment, which was the behavior of the children in one of the, or in so I imagine you saw greater engagement and greater enjoyment in different groups. So I reckon in low variability group, fairly low engagement, or at least compliance, and fairly low enjoyment levels. In the variability group, all the kids in the low variability would have been looking up the line to see the ones that were doing it if you were doing it concurrently, which you may have not been. And then the ones in the high variability group are probably having, absolutely a whale of a time. So, and also they're massively engaged in the process. So in my mind, if you were to get a completely zero base of, in terms of the retention finding that you were looking for, if you were to get that, but you still had that observational thing that actually they really enjoyed this, that's a really great finding. And but you found that there's a moderate difference. One is and that the high variability one has got probably the slightly better in terms of retention. Well, that's enough for me, because if we can have fun and have a great time and then have more people engaged, and actually there's not a great difference in efficacy, we'll go for that one, surely. Now, if you were to find that it was a significant, kind of degradation in efficacy in terms of, the development of movement capability, right, that would be different, right? Maybe we'd then start to think, maybe we've got some tough decisions to make now about how we can make something that's ostensibly really boring, make it a bit more fun without losing the efficacy piece. So that bit there is kind of really important, and I think needs to be factored into certainly when we come into like youth sport, children's sport, needs to be factored into experimental design. Because at the moment, I think a lot of the design of experiments, and I have debates with many academic colleagues in your world around this, is that everything tends to be focused on the efficacy piece, which I understand from a skill act perspective, but the real world application also has to have that engagement and enjoyment element wrapped in as well.
Yeah, no, there are some exceptions. So I'm going to defend my field as a whole here a little bit and say, Gethin Thomas and the stuff that he's done around rugby union, I think there was a big emphasis there on that as well. And it is, I think, the European sports coaching framework. I think some of the stuff they talk about there is, primary is fun, and if we can get some learning in there as well, better. But our primary has got to be fun when it comes to children's engagement. And the other bit is that, because it is a false dichotomy. So when we talk about, is this about learning or is this about fun? That's not correct to separate those two. I think it can be useful. But obviously stuff that you're playfully engaged with, you can learn a lot from, and things that are seem like quite serious practice to the outside can be interpreted as fun by individuals as well. So we've got to be careful that we don't kind of dichotomize too much. And the other bit is, and this comes from, there's a really fantastic book by Benjamin Bloom. It's called The Development of Talent in Young People. Studied lots of different domains, not just sport. Now it's old now, 1985, I think, but really fascinating insights. But one of the key messages to take away from that book is that it's not just, you engage in play at this age and then up to practice, but that at all stages, you've got play and you've got practice. And this actually it's older than this. It's 1922. It's a guy called Alfred North Whitehead. He's talking about mainstream education as opposed to sport, but it's the same message. So he talks about the rhythms, and I love that word, the rhythms. You can imagine two drum beats, and they're pulsing, and you've got a rhythm of play and a rhythm of practice. He calls it the rhythm of freedom and the rhythm of discipline. And he says early in development, freedom, playful engagement is the most important, and that's the dominant drum beat, but you've still got that little drum beat of discipline in there if you want to be most effective. And, session by session, year by year, the pulse, these two rhythms will change. One will come stronger, one will come weaker, and they'll work together. And I think that's an incredibly powerful metaphor. But I think what we see too much of in youth sport is the extremes. So people either go, you're here to learn, and my job here is to get you better at this sports skill. So we're going to do some serious practice to improve that. Learning is the outcome here. Or they go too far the other side, and it's just pure engagement, or pure just playing around and not interacting with the children, not tweaking the environment or tweaking the game to get a particular outcome that you think is needed. And I think the misunderstanding is not so much, is either people go to extremes, or else people don't understand the dose requirement of play and practice. So if you're talking about young people, you need a minimum effective dose of serious practice sometimes. And you do need that. So I can remember playing rugby underage. I was on the sideline with a couple of other subs, and we were chucking a ball around. And one of the coaches from the older groups walked by, and he went, "Has anybody ever shown you how to pass?" And we were like, No, you just throw a ball from one person to another. And he spent 5 minutes with us. And in that 5 minutes, he just tweaked a couple of small things, and suddenly this ball that was looping through the air slowly was zipping around between the three of us. And it wasn't the most fun, because it was a case of, no, you need to think about what you're doing here. You need to get this right, this position. And then he did a really important thing. He cleared off. Because he had given us the skills that were necessary for us to engage a little bit better with our peer group. So actually, suddenly we could engage and we could play the game. We were missing that little piece. So most of the time needs to be spent, I think, in this playful and game environment. But occasionally, watch carefully, the minimum necessary dose of more serious practice, even at a young age, even with fundamental movement skills, can be important. Ideally, you'll get that through play. Ideally, you'll get that through constraints. That would be really nice. Because the other thing I learned doing this PhD study is this deliberate, prescriptive, directed teaching with instruction and demonstrations. That's bloody hard when you've got 30 kids. It's incredibly time efficient. Break down the time. How much time can you spend with each individual? And that's what really excited and attracted me to the constraints-based approach, because can I design games or activities that will do the teaching for me? Can I design activities where I shift the target? And it's one of the things that I catch every single year when I watch students designing games to teach throwing. And a very common feature is they put the target down low, so they'll throw into the corner because it catches all the balls of the bean bags, and it's nice and neat and helps the organization of the session. But actually, if we have them throwing a little bit higher, there's a little bit of research from quite a while ago now that suggests that aiming for a target that's above your head and up in the distance, actually it encourages you to lean back a little bit, and the arm gets in the right position because the target encourages the arm to get into the right position. So how can we design activities? And there's a lovely game called Snowball that we've used for quite a few years in Chichester. Ed Christian and Craig Pulling developed on from a game that was published in the literature. But the game of Snowball is a game that has certain rules in there to promote a stepping action if you've got children who aren't stepping, and to promote trunk action, and to promote a good arm action, without ever demonstrating, without ever instructing. The needs of the game, or the tasks, constraints in the game, promote these developed actions, and that's much more efficient. I think that's the promise. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if we've got the research to say this absolutely works and transfers over, but that's the promise of the constraints-based approach. And that's the bit that really excited me. We can be so much more efficient in our teaching if we understand how to manipulate constraints better.
Now, so I want to dwell on this a little bit, and I just think this is quite a fascinating area for me. And it's an area that I think I'm sort of constantly exploring within. I'm really glad, because when you said about this minimum effective dose, and the example you gave was somebody coming in with essentially, kind of a small amount of kind of instructional stuff. And I think you're right in some respects, in the sense that it's not always possible for an individual to discover more or less effective movement necessarily, without sometimes being given an alternative, or at the very least being offered, if you like, probably a better phrase, offered something else as an opportunity, and then to at least compare and contrast between the two. So I do agree with that. But what I was also really, really interested was that you then said, but one way of achieving that is to modify the activity so that the individual needs to move in a different way, and then ask them to reflect on the different movements, as opposed to, and I think this is one of the challenges, is that, so a lot of people, obviously, I've come down on my big kind of anti-drill stance, which seems to follow me around everywhere. But that's really based on this idea of we just jump in there far too quickly and far too easily. Yes. And it's kind of almost like a default. And so, oh, right, we've got a movement solution we need to develop here, right? Okay, we're going to do an isolated movement drill, and then we'll go back to what we're doing, and then that'll solve the problem. My point being is, can we avoid doing that? Because what we don't want to do is, firstly, I just think it's a bit lazy, if I'm honest. And secondly, we know there are challenges with transferability, so therefore it's not particularly effective, or can not be effective. And then the third bit is, I'm worried about the engagement piece. And I do see still, as I go round, I still see lots of young people stood in queues, waiting for their turn, having minimum, and you could just see it. They're getting maximum effective dose, maximum ineffective dose they're getting of those processing. So the fact that you've said, right, well, what we can do is we can let the practice, if we design the practice well enough, and if we're skillful enough in making adaptations to the practice in order to bring about the different movements, then we can allow that to help those individuals to move in different ways. And that's what I think, for me, is, I'm like you, is so attractive to the constraints-based approach, because you're not having to live in these dichotomies of making the decision of how much of the minimum effective dose of kind of movement instruction do I need to give in order to minimize the engagement. What you can do is maximize engagement and maximize the kind of the movement practice element. And therefore, you're not having to make those trade-offs. That's the real attractive thing. Now, I do think it's challenging, and I do think it's difficult, and I definitely think there are limitations. And the limitations are mostly my imagination. But I still think there's so much value to be derived from that methodology that it's worthy of exploration.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things for me that you have to go with, or you have to look for, is the athlete's understanding. Because an athlete can explore and explore and explore and explore, but if they've got some misunderstanding about the process, they're not going to reach the right solution, because that misunderstanding will act as a block to prevent them to do that.
Sure.
So 2 examples. So again, track and field is my main discipline. Very commonly, you will see athletes who take off too close to the bar in high jump, and they end up knocking the bar on the way up.
Yeah.
And repeatedly, I've had examples of athletes who, they're knocking and knocking and knocking the bar, and they can't figure out why they're knocking the bar. That's my role as a coach. Okay, so we walk over, have a chat with the athlete. Okay, watch 3, 4, 5 times, get a picture of what's consistently happening. Go, okay, where do you think you're taking off? Now, one of 2 things will happen there. They'll either think they're taking off way further out than they are. Perfect, we've got a solution. Or they'll think they should be taking off really close, and they are taking off really close. Again, perfect, we've got a solution. But we've got to understand what the athlete's trying to do, what the athlete's understanding is, before we can then go and fix that. And then it's a case of, I want you to, we can go question based. Well, what do you think will happen when you take off here? Or what do you think the advantages or disadvantages? Why do you think you're knocking the bar off? What could be causing that on the way up? We can engage in that kind of discussion, and we can get the athlete to explore, because this is what it is about for me. Even when you're stepping in, it's not that we're not exploring anymore, we're becoming directive. I want you to explore this little area as opposed to this bigger area. And we're just narrowing down the area where you're going to go and explore for a while. And I will often go, if I get that situation in high jump, I want you to take off with your foot even closer and further away. And let's play with those different positions. And then you tell me what's going on. Because what I want from the athlete is not just that they can move better, but they understand the process of learning how to move better. I want every athlete who leaves my session to be a better learner, because again, in athletics traditionally as a discipline, you do an awful lot of the practice on your own. So how do we engage in making our athletes more skillful at learning itself, understanding the process of learning? And these are only small things. They're throwaway comments that, many occasions athletes, especially younger athletes, won't even know until I've said them a couple of 100 times, and then they're starting to get them in and going, yeah, Phil, I hear you. This is what, we slow to start, watch other people, all the other kind of little bits and pieces that we can do. I think that bit about understanding is really important. Yeah, and then once we have understanding, get out of there again, because it's not about reinforcing. I think this is one of the big things I have with drills. So it's about blunt force repetition. Let's drill this into muscle memory, which again is a whole other topic. But you've misunderstood the purpose of isolating or part practice or breaking something down. The purpose is not to develop a really refined movement pattern representation. The purpose is to develop an understanding of, that's what I need to do. That's what that feels like. That feels a bit weird or different. Okay, now you've got enough information to go away and try it in the game or go away and play with it some more yourself. But it's about gaining understanding. That's the outcome we're trying to get there. And I think that again gives you a better rationale as to why sometimes you might step in and give this minimum dose of instruction or a more direct interaction with someone.
What I love though about what you've done there is so a lot of people, and I've definitely fallen into this trap myself over the years. When we're coaches, we're kind of part of the reason we're coaches is because we're kind of pre-programmed to help others. And as a result, when you see somebody who has a problem and you know that you know what the solution is, or at least one of the solutions, then you feel duty bound to offer that solution. It's probably one of my biggest issues, particularly in discussions I'll have with my wife. Sometimes, she'll come to me with a problem and I'll offer a solution. And almost every time, that's completely the wrong thing to do. Quite often, what she wants to do is she wants to explore the problem with me and to bounce the idea around with me until, partly sometimes just to actually, because she wants to verbalize it and get it, kind of just almost like get rid of it.
Think it through.
Yeah, and then sometimes it is just thinking it through and then maybe coming up with some solutions herself. So obviously using a questioning approach is a much better solution, a much better way of approaching that. What you've done there, though, is instead of stepping in there and going, right, you're doing this wrong, therefore you now need to do this, what you've done is you've asked a question around, you kind of focused their attention, haven't you? You've said, you've sort of said, where I bet you that's the first time they've considered where their foot's taking off from, and I don't think I know. Right, well let's see what you know about that now. Let's see where your awareness is. The first thing you're doing is you're eliciting information, aren't you? You're saying, almost asking them, where is your awareness? And the other thing you're doing there as well, and I imagine you probably do this as well, which is you're kind of framing the task slightly differently for them. Because I think this is the important thing. Often the individual doesn't necessarily have enough understanding of what the task they're trying to complete is, because they're still attending to so many of the different variables of the movement they have to do. The actual task that they're trying to achieve, which is get over the bar, they don't realize actually that what they're doing is they're the reason they're hitting it is the wrong thing. They're not really attending. So you just say to them, "Where's your foot? Whereabouts is your foot taking off?" Right. I don't know. Okay. Go again, and then you can tell me this time. It's here. Okay. Is that going to help you with this task, or is it going to hinder you with this task? Now that's it. Now all of a sudden they've got an active piece of realization that they can use as a reference point in the future, and that's going to be they're going to resonate with them forever, as opposed to you come in and go, take off further away. That's just not got any involvement of them in at all. They're literally passive recipients of information. If that sticks with them, great. If it doesn't, then they're going to need you forevermore. Whereas in your context, they're the active learner discovering the means by which they can solve this problem that they currently have.
Yeah, and I mean, track and field is these are not overly complex events when you compare it to a football or a hockey pitch. You go from the start to the finish as fast as you can, or you run from here to there, jump as far as you can. But they're not overly complex. But because you're trying to push the boundaries of what you can do, actually the margins for error are quite small. And so you do see lots of coaches interacting with athletes, even at World Championships levels, about minor corrections and trying to figure out what's going on. So I'm coming from the context of working with a local athletics club where you have very few coaches to very high numbers of athletes. I can't support every athlete who are in a competition. They're competing all over the place. So I need them to be able to look after themselves a little bit. I need them to be able to understand, as you say, oh, this is happening. Why is that happening? I can work out for myself why that's happening. And the other thing I want, of course, is that, again, because one of the big advantages to track and field in the UK as opposed to Ireland is that under 13, under 15, you've got league competitions which are team-based. So you've got A and B string. They both score points for the team. So if we want the team to do better, great. You need to be a good teammate. You need to be able to help that person. You need to be able to understand what they're looking for and give them some feedback and some information as well. And so it gives us a great opportunity to get that social interaction and build better teammates through how we do that as well. So I think it's we want much more than a short-term change. And these little interactions give us opportunities to develop those broader aspects that we want, as opposed to just movement competence. And of course, we can also just play with constraints. So again, the other option I can do there is I can take in a plyometric box, and I can stick a plyometric box a little bit further out from the high jump mat. Because the great thing about a plyometric box is you can jump 20, 30 centimeters higher than you've ever jumped before. You can get a huge amount of air time. And one of the things I really like doing in athletics contexts, I'll throw out some small hurdles. Before the start of a session, walk away. Guarantee you there will be some athletes, particularly the younger athletes, running over going, do you think can we sneak on running over hurdles? Fantastic. Stick out a box by the high jump, end of the session. I've had middle distance guys coming over going, oh, that looks really fun. Run up, jump off a box, launch yourself up into the air, land on some crash mats. Yes, we're going doing that. But actually what you're also doing is teaching them to attack, because you've got to attack to get onto the box, then get up in the air. And you're also teaching them about takeoff position. So, there's a lot of things that you can potentially gain. Now, other people can pick up the wrong message. So again, you're constraining the situation, you're not prescribing it. So somebody else might use the box and use it to launch themselves horizontally. So suddenly that constraint is having the wrong impact on somebody. But that's your job as a coach, to be watching, is this constraint promoting the change in the right direction? And if it's doing something that I don't want, then I've got to step in. And again, that's the other bit where I think people are too, you mentioned it earlier, people are too keen to step in. There are certain things where you have to step in and have to step in straight away. So, in high jump, depending on the position of where you put your foot, you can actually set yourself up for a repetitive strain injury because your foot's in the wrong position and the human ankle is not meant to take force through that angle. You're going to hurt yourself. So if you see that, you've got to stop that as soon as possible. And there are other examples in bowling and cricket. So there are things that you absolutely have to stop. But people need to have a really good understanding about what is style and what is against the laws of physics and your body can't handle. And I think, far too much people are too conscious of style issues as opposed to what are fundamental issues.
Yeah, that's an area that I'm kind of keen to explore as well. So kind of just from a selfish perspective, given that I've got a man with your expertise on, I'm one of the things I'm intrigued by, and I'd love to get your opinion on it. So I've got a load of under 11 cricketers who I will be coaching tonight. We're coming towards the end of our season. And in particular, a number of them. So we've worked it's been fascinating to watch them develop over the season, actually. Several of them at the start of the season, even though I've been with them since they were under nines. Spent quite a lot of time doing kind of bowling games and things like that. Bowling is an interesting thing. It's one of those things where everybody seems to find their own way. You never really see two bowling actions almost exactly the same. Run up slightly different. And it's quite a fascinating thing that, given that ultimately it's about delivery of an object with both accuracy and speed, or accuracy and always accuracy. Anyway, and one of the things is that my son actually bowls a lot in the garden with me, but also he goes out there. He recently had a real problem. He'd lost accuracy, completely lost accuracy. And I think part of that was to do with the fact that he was playing with older kids and he wanted to show them, kind of how fast he could bowl. So he developed a bit of a movement habit or a movement pattern that I've seen before, where essentially, in an effort to develop force, his head would drop down to the side, and it also then means that his arm was essentially diagonally, instead of sort of being sort of a bit more vertical, perhaps quite diagonal. And as a result, his accuracy just completely lost, where it's just bowling wide ball after wide ball after wide ball. So anyway, he discovered this problem, and then when we were in practice, he discovered it still, and his release points were everywhere, and he was losing. So I'm there thinking to myself, right, here's an interesting challenge. I was thinking, right, there's a number of ways of approaching this in terms of helping him overcome this particular challenge, and I can imagine this probably equating in javelin and things like that, or although the accuracy requirement, very lot of similarities, I guess. And so the approach I took was, I said to him, right, what do you think is going to help you to get more accurate? And he said to me, slowing down a bit. I said, well, maybe, but you still want to try and bowl fast, don't you? Because that's what you're trying to do here. So I said, what's going to help you get more accurate? I said, what is it? Where are you looking at when you go to bowl? And he said, I don't know. I said, that's probably worth looking at, isn't it? Just have a look at that. And so, funnily enough, he then, after the session ended, he went off into the nets, as he often does with his friends, and they go off and do stuff. And I think usually they've discovered something in the session that they then want to go and, anyway, they spend hours in there, which is brilliant, great. And he literally said, I'm not batting, I'm just going to bowl. And he bowled 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 and he bowled. And he came out of it, he said, you know what, that really made a big difference, just looking in the spot to bowl that. I was like, well, that's useful. But then I noticed, though, that he still had issues later on. I still noticed he had issues with accuracy, largely some of that to do with kind of release points. So then one of the things I said to him was, I said, what are you aware of about the way your arm's coming over? I said, do you know where it is? And I said, so like, if I'm a clock face, where do you think, when you let go of the ball, where do you think your arm is? And he said, oh, I think it's at about 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock, whichever way you're doing it. And I said, okay, well, let's do it again and let's see. And I did a little bit of video on the phone, and then he looked at the video and went, oh, blimey, it's out there. Now, so that's what he did. So he did that. And then he got his accuracy. But here's my problem, right? Lasith Malinga. So for those people who don't know Lasith Malinga, he's a guy who played for Sri Lanka, who essentially bowls a ball, and this is probably for those people who are involved in baseball, they probably know of pitchers who essentially deliver the ball with his arm horizontal. But because he does that, he's very difficult to play. He obviously delivers the ball in a way that very few batsmen have seen. It's very hard. It's the equivalent of like a softball pitcher, isn't it, in comparison to a baseball pitcher?
Yes.
Anyway,
I was thinking of Jenny Finch.
Yeah. I mean, that's brilliant, isn't it? Do you see that thing with Albert Pujols who wouldn't hit it?
Absolutely fabulous.
Isn't it, just because they haven't got the visual reference of her. Anyway, long story short, I'll get to the point of this in the end. So I wasn't sure whether I was doing the right thing, because I felt like he had a chance for efficiency or greater accuracy, maybe at the expense of power to a degree, by having a more vertical arm that gave him the opportunity to deliver the ball straighter. That's my perception of what he might do, and he needs to explore those two things. It did work for him. But my concern is, if Lasith Malinga's learnt to deliver the ball with accuracy with an arm out to the side, have I just essentially taken away an opportunity for a young person to develop that capability?
Yeah, this is a really, really tricky one. Because, again, you're most comfortable where there is really good research saying this is a problem. So the example I gave in high jump, there's some research there showing actually if your foot lands in that position, early retirement is heading your direction. There's an Australian group that's done loads of studies on the mixed bowling action in cricket. So they've looked backwards at these guys are all getting injured. What's the problem? Well, they're mostly using this technique. They tracked a whole of the guys forward in time, and the guys who have this mixed technique are the guys who are much more likely to get injured. So there you've got some really strong evidence that says that's a problem. We shouldn't be encouraging that. All right. What you're describing is a little bit more again, you've got a short-term problem, and you don't know whether it's going to turn out to be a long-term. He could gain accuracy and have an unusual technique, which might be advantageous and not have any physical detriment. Or you could have, actually, it will turn out to be problematic in some way, and it'll also be very demotivating if he's losing accuracy all the time.
Absolutely.
And I am. There's a need for me to be a good scientist here. All right. And what I mean by that is a good scientist says, I don't know a hell of a lot. Because there's ground where I am confident and I can make strong recommendations, and there's grounds where I go, I think this is probably right, but not convinced, and there's grounds where I go, you know what, I haven't got a clue. In this case, I'm thinking, that the exploration is really good, so that I like that clock metaphor. I'm always wary about zoning in on a solution. And so it's important, I think, that we keep the variability in there as much as possible. And so, I'm going to give it, you asked a slightly long-winded question, so I'm going to take advantage and give a slightly long-winded answer.
I appreciate that. I went on forever.
So I'm going to give an example from high jump, and then trying what that would look like in cricket as well. So recently working with an athlete who the long jump run-up wasn't particularly good. It was a bit too tight, which meant they were losing speed and they were off balance when they were coming in. So the standard solution is, well, we just need to change the arc of the run-up a little bit. So we did, but we didn't just change the arc of the run-up to make it what would worked out eventually as the optimal shape. We explored quite a lot of different shapes in that run-up. So some were quite steep turn at the end, some were quite broad and long turn. So we did lots of exploration around that, and we found this is the long jump run-up that's working really well now. But this athlete is 15 years old. This athlete is going to change and grow and develop. They are going to get stronger. There's a lovely phrase: optimal positions of anatomical strength. So you talked about all these bowlers delivering the ball in a slightly different way. Yesterday, I was looking at stick figures of loads of different world record and world champion javelin throwers. And all the stick figures were overlaid over each other, so you could see the slight individual differences that they all had. And those are due to, in part, these optimal positions of anatomical strength. I can't take a massive step when I deliver a javelin because my core strength isn't strong enough to allow me to utilize the energy that I'm developing. I'll just be wasting it. So there's a different position for me. What's important is that an individual learns how to explore and find what's best for them right now. And you've got to move away from, I think that's a bit that's missing a lot of the time. People talk about finding individual specific techniques. Yes, but individual and temporarily specific techniques. What's best for you in this moment right now? And understand when we're working with a developing athlete that they will continue to develop. And therefore we need to keep exploration in there. So this athlete, high jumper, has a run-up, but we're going to be exploring different shapes of run-ups for the next 5-6 years. And so with your cricket bowling as well, again, and this comes a little bit from differential learning. So I cannot stand over it categorically and say absolutely, but this is where I Phil, the scientist, takes a back seat. Phil, the coach, comes forward and says, I'd play with bowling and putting the hand in different clock positions as you bowl. And just keep an element in that. So how variable can you be and still deliver the outcome?
Yeah.
And this comes back to a classic problem in long jump, for instance. Lots of people in long jump think that your goal is to get your run up absolutely consistent. You step in the same place every single time and then bang, you've learned the run up. In reality, the best long jumpers, or a good proportion of the best long jumpers and pole vaulters and triple jumpers, they sight the board. So about halfway up the run up, they're looking at the board and they're adjusting their steps. And then, right now I'm going to hit the board. They look up and they don't look at the board anymore. But lots of introductory coaches say you should never look at the board.
Mm.
And so I've seen examples of kids running along with their heads stuck up in the air. And of course, they're fouling massively because they're not engaging with the information source that's available to them.
Mm.
We don't want you looking down at the board when you take off, because laws of physics are going to cause problems for us. But we want to teach people to exploit this information source that's available. We want to teach them to be able to start from any different position, adjust their steps naturally in the run-up, because your body's complex. You have the capacity to do that and hit the board every time. And there's a lovely study just published. Needham, I think, was the name of the author, in pole vault, and they looked at. They said we've got some pole vaulters who are using an adaptive run-up, so they're sighting the box and they're adjusting their steps as they go up. And we've got some pole vaulters who are trying to hit their feet in the exact same position every time, so a stereotyped run-up. Personal best-wise, exactly the same, right? They're equally good as each other. But the group that were having a stereotyped run-up, they had about 50% success rate in attempts during the filming sessions. And it was about half the time they're not able to complete the jump because they're in the wrong place. And the adaptive group, 94% of the time or something, they were able to complete the jump. And it comes back to the really good diving research that Keith Davids presented a little bit at in Cork. I can't remember the name of the first author, but really lovely work. Stopping people from balking and saying, no, you have to get yourself out of trouble. You have to go through with this. That's key. Learning to be an adaptive performer, because the wind will be different. The track surface will be different. You personally will be different every single time that you jump. We've got to teach you to be able to deal with that. And so I think encouraging a little bit of variability, coming back to sustaining that. Can you play with and deliver the ball from a slightly different position? That's not a bad thing. Let's keep that variability in there. And some of my biomechanics colleagues will say, you're probably also reducing the strain on the body as well. You're spreading that load a little bit around, which is probably safer long-term as well, and preventing overuse injuries.
Which is, yeah, I mean, and that, I suppose that's a massive concern as well. That's fascinating, actually, that point about the kind of stereotype versus the adaptive run-up, because again, coming back to bowling, there's an interesting parallel there as well, where I think most coaches who do bowling want the bowler to have a stereotype run-up so that they have feel a degree of comfort as they're moving up towards the delivery stride. They don't overstep and deliver no balls, all these sorts of things. And I would traditionally, I suppose, have adopted that as well. So, you'd pace it out or whatever it is. You find your means by which, interestingly, a lot of bowlers pace their run-ups out. I always feel as if I think you should run it out. You should make it real. And your landing point should be your starting point, if that's the run-up you're going to use. But what's really interesting is I've found that, and I would always traditionally discourage young bowlers from using a more adaptive run-up approach, because firstly, I don't think they should be looking at the line as they run up. They should be looking at where they want to deliver the ball to. So there is a bit of difference, I suppose, between that task versus the long jump task. But interestingly, and so also young people who run up and they have a little bit of a stutter step because they realize, actually, I'm out of sync here, so I'm going to adjust in order to make sure I deliver. Again, I would ordinarily have said, oh, that seems to be a bit inefficient to me. You looks like, you're having to adjust, and maybe that's going to affect your delivery capability. But I'm going to have to sort of rethink that now, I think. I'm going to have to go away and have a little bit of think about that, as to say, maybe an adaptive run-up opportunity. And actually, why does there need to be a single run-up? For example, if you're going to deliver a different type of delivery, perhaps you need a different type of run-up. You need a run-up.
Well, you might be giving a cue to your batsman there, so you got to be careful with that one.
Indeed, and I take the point. But I sort of feel like, well, for example, if you bowl on the other side of the wicket, so round the wicket ostensibly, that's automatically going to create a different kind of run-up anyway. But what I'm trying to say is, so having a degree of ability to have variability within your run-up probably isn't a bad thing anyway. But
something just occurred to me, and again, it's an alternative thought. Rather than saying, can you deliver two different balls off the same run-up, It'd be really nice to be able to deliver the same ball off of two different run-ups.
Ah, yeah, okay.
So your batsman's looking there going, oh, this is different.
Yes.
But no, it's not at the end. In terms of the stutter bit, you're right. If they are stuttering, that is inefficient. But that also means that they're not capable of regulating their steps to land in the right place. So it's actually, it's a skill that they haven't learned. Because being able to regulate your steps, that's a skill. This is not a big adjustment. It's a minor adjustment in how you're moving, but it's a minor adjustment that should be able to flow naturally into your movement, and you shouldn't be able to see the adjustment. It should be really, really minor. Some cricket bowlers do this. There was a really nice study recently where they showed that when you haven't got an umpire there, it messes up the run-up a little bit because they're used to that source of information.
Yeah.
And the final bit you said is you like your bowlers looking at where they're going to deliver the ball. That's fine. But do they need to do that all the way through the run-up?
Yeah.
So we've got our first stage of our run-up where we're accelerating, where potentially we're looking down, and certainly in long jump we're looking down. We've got a second stage where we are sighting the board or sighting the line that you've got to bowl from potentially. And that sighting period is about locking in. And once you're locked in, you're done. You've got a check mark. I'm here. I'm 5, 6, 7 strides away. There's going to be some variation in that last 5, 6, 7 strides, but there's not going to be that much variation. I'm still going to hit the board. So I don't need to look at the board anymore. Now I can look up, which for me gets the physical projection bit. Now you can lock into where you're going to deliver the ball from.
Yeah.
And again, it just makes that bit puts more emphasis on that aspect of the skill for the bowler. So you talked about earlier your son not knowing where he looked when he delivered the ball.
Yeah.
Again, actually, this is part of the skill.
Yeah.
Part of the skill is lock, target. Okay, let it happen.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. And I think you're making an important point as well. Is that there are. What we also want to try and avoid, I think, as much as possible, is to allow the athlete to ignore important perceptual cues or pieces of information. Like you say, for example, a line for delivery for a long jumper, or a line to that's an important part of the task at hand, isn't it? That I need to hit that board. It is interesting actually, because I think that finding from that research around the adaptive run-up being far more efficient in terms of a reduction in fouls, that's such a massive part in long jump that can determine whether somebody progresses in the competition and not. That's got to be factored in, hasn't it?
Frank Dick is written a lot in terms of athletics coaching. He talks about the inertia that some ideas have. And that's just an example of an idea that has such inertia. This isn't new. Stuff in the 1970s was showing the importance of adaptive elements. Hurdlers, you cannot be a good long hurdler unless you can regulate your steps efficiently, and you practice that by running hurdles over random distances, or by having your coach sneakily manipulate where the hurdles are placed each time, so you cannot rely on previous positions. So it's not a new idea. But it's just, and again, it's the next level. So, long jump, ostensibly really simple. You run up and jump. But actually, if we're trying to perform to the utmost of an individual's potential, then there's an awful lot of little skills involved in that. And I said one of the often forgotten ones, I think, is the sighting the board and learning how to do that.
And does this correlate with, I've spent a bit of time kind of digging into Gabby Wolf's work on focus of attention, and you said that you'd spent some time with that as well. This sort of ties in with that, really, doesn't it, around external, internal? Where do you come on that? Because there's obviously, I've heard a lot of people having some quite interesting discussions recently about where the internal, external focus of attention should be. It might actually be worth just doing I know it's a body of research, a 30-year body of research or thereabouts. But, if you could just recap it in a couple of minutes, then that'd be useful before we have the discussion.
Easy. Well, I think my background to it is I came across it first and I thought, nah. Too subtle.
Yeah.
You're telling me this small a change. Okay. So I read a little bit more. And step one as a researcher, you don't want to be inefficient. You want to read it, and the literature is quite solid within what they have studied. So accepting that that's often quite short term and quite basic tasks.
Yeah.
Within what they have studied, this is a really strong finding. And then I went and I said, okay, well, the next thing you do, I'm going to do a bit of research myself. So I did actually published a study on focus of attention in golf light. So it's not actually golf putting, it's indoor mat, no slope, there's no green reading. So it is absolutely not putting, but it allowed me to learn more about internal, external focus of attention. And I am one of those researchers who found in that context, external focus of attention was better than, one particular external focus of attention was better than internal, because there's different types of things.
Which, sorry, just as a matter of interest, which external focus?
So it was a putting task.
Yeah.
I had internal focus, which is your classic. I had a proximal external focus, which is focusing on the movement of the club in some way. And I had a distal external focus, which is focusing on the ball or the target. What was slightly different about my experiment, because I did a pilot test and I was trying to find out what cues I was going to use, and different cues were different people, or they preferred different cues in the pilot testing. So I thought, I'm just going to keep this, and I would explain what an internal focus was, and I'd give them 2 or 3 examples, and then I'd give them a block of trials where they could play around with those different ones, and then they'd come back and they'd go, okay, Phil, I think I like this idea of focusing on a pendulum swing of my arms. I like that. And I'd go, yeah, perfect, that's an internal focus, use that. And then with the club, they'd go, I really like focusing on the weight of the club head and just feeling the weight of the club head move through. And I said, perfect, that's proximal external, do that. And then distal, it was things like, I really like the idea of burning a line into the carpet. So I can imagine a burnt line of grass, and I'm going to send the ball along that burnt line of grass. So I'm just imagining that burnt line as I go. Or I'm imagining the ball slowing down and dropping into the hole. So even though I'm moving the club, I'm thinking about what's going to happen in the future. So I gave people a choice as to what they wanted to think about. And the reason, again, it's a really small experiment. Previous research had shown in putting there was no difference between a proximal external and an internal focus. I replicated that finding, but the distal external focus was better than either of them. Right. So again, in the simpler task, a more distal external focus was more effective. And I think there's enough research now that you could say for less skilled individuals, a more proximal external focus is better. So focusing on the movement of the racket or the implement that you're using, something closer to the body but still external. The more skilled you are, you can use a more distal focus. If you're talking about novices but it's a simpler task, you could use a distal focus. But as the task becomes more complex, you might need to shift to a more proximal focus. And there's some good kind of theory behind that as well. And I love focus of attention for teaching students about skill acquisition, because there's loads of research. It's accessible research. There's some nice, straightforward theories to explain behind it. It's really good. Would it be my go-to when I'm working with an athlete? No. I think there are other things that I can do which will give me more bang for my buck in terms of the time and the interaction that I have. So is it one thing that I would include? Yes, I talk about focus of attention. I do in my own coaching try to use external more than internal. I guess the big thing I've taken from it, and again, I know everyone doesn't agree on this, but I think golf is an ideal example, because we did a really nice study. Charlie Godwin was one of my students, and he did a really lovely study, and we built on it with golfers, and looking at the different focus of attention that they used when they were playing around a golf. So we basically caught them. Charlie met them at the end of the 18th green, and then he would say, okay, what was the first shot that you hit? What did you think about? What was the second shot, third shot? So we got lots of different shots, and we got lots of different foci of attention reported. And some of these shots were, this is a perfect lie on the green, nice and close, my preferred club, so really nice situation. Others were under the lip of a bunker, really nasty situation. And for me, looking at it, it was really interesting to see, well, some golfers have have the same focus in all these different situations. And they don't have a strong rationale as to why they have that focus. And other golfers, very few, are adapting their focus much more, and they have a strong reason for why they're adapting their focus. And that's kind of led me to the thought that if you are engaging in something like golf, or if you're a decathlete doing lots of different events, you don't just bring a bag of golf clubs onto the golf course. You bring a bag of swing thoughts as well. And you match the swing thought to the context that you're in. So it might be a little bit more proximal, it might be a little more distal, might be a little bit more holistic. I think that for me has been the key learning that I have, and that's where I am at the moment in terms of the advice I give. But the really important thing, and this goes back to, I mean, you can make a broader parallel to coaching. What's more important than what you're doing, what you're focusing on, is your reasoning behind why you're doing what you're doing. I think if somebody has a strong reason and is testing that reason, is this working, they will evolve towards better practice, a better focus of attention. So it's making sure that you're aware of the range of options that you have, and then engaging in some exploration and some testing, and using the right focus in this case for each situation.
So, yeah, it's interesting the whole area, because I think for a lot of people, I mean, it may well be. I mean, it was certainly a bit of an eye opener for me when, it made me reflect on, the kind of cues that I would offer and the kind of areas of exploration. So even in that the example I gave you earlier, talking about my son and helping him with his bowling, I gave him probably at one point, I probably unwittingly, without again thinking about it too much, probably gave him an internal cue around his arm. I gave him my initial area was an external. So where are you looking? Where are you targeting? How are you targeting? What's your focus point? And I suppose I could have explored that even further and talked about smaller landing areas, even maybe giving him a visual cue of a bullseye target, and has he hit his own bullseye or whatever. I could have even used an external focus, as in could have used constraints and created sort of zonal target areas for him to bowl at, but you don't get them on a cricket field, so it lacks a little bit of representation. And I kind of almost want him to create his own visual representation of a targeting system that he can use as a means by which to find his mechanism, because that at least takes one element of variability away. Firstly, if you're looking in all sorts of different directions and you haven't got a particular focus, the likelihood is that you're going to deliver the ball in all sorts of different directions. But the second piece around that was, so we found there's a degree of improvement to that, but I haven't probably explored enough within that. So then immediately my jump then was, right, where's your arm? So that's an internal focus. So I've gone straight from a distal focus to an internal focus, and I actually didn't even explore. And I was just reflecting as you were talking about what the distal focus might be, and actually it could have been the ball. So, for example, where is the seam of the ball pointing?
Could have seam of the ball, but you're actually quite close when you talk about that clock metaphor. So again, some of Gabby Wolf's stuff and some of Nick Winkelman talks a lot about metaphors being actually acting in a similar way to an external focus as well. Okay. So if the image is of a clock position, so if you're saying, I want you to show me the clock face at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever the case may be, as long as and again, this is what is the athlete doing? Because that's the most important thing here. So what does the athlete do with the instructions that you give? If the athlete then goes and holds this image of a clock face, that's a subtle difference, but it seems to be enough to be external. Or if you say, I want you to move the ball. Yeah. So the ball is at whatever time. That might be enough to prevent the thinking about the body and the reference to the body that seems to be disruptive to movement patterns.
Right. Okay, that's interesting to note. Okay, maybe I'd done myself a disservice there. Okay, I quite like that idea actually of almost like creating visual metaphors that are a means by which that it takes the focus, like you say, away from. Because the one thing I was interesting was having, because obviously Gabby travels everywhere with Rebecca Luthwaite, doesn't she? And
yes.
Rebecca Luthwaite's research around micro choking I found quite interesting as well. This idea that when you become more aware of bodily movement, it creates this almost sort of semi-involuntary movement that may or may not be advantageous to the task that you're trying to perform. I thought that was quite an interesting finding.
Yeah, the level at which you're controlling your movements changes slightly, and not beneficially, because when we try and take more control over a well-learned movement, it doesn't work. We've known that since the 1890s studies on piano players. When I think about my fingers, it all goes to pot. So it's really, really old. And the other thing actually, which comes from Nick Winkelman, I think, but the other bit is you could put a bit of tape on the forearm. So it's not about aligning your arm; it's about aligning that bit of tape.
Yeah.
And again, it's just that slight little change. And again, it's a subtle thing. But I think it's a useful challenge for coaches to think about their language, the importance of language, and how subtle changes in what you're doing in this one area can influence what your athlete is thinking about and what's happening with your athlete.
I think it's particularly prevalent in implement-based sports. So, for example, like golf's a really good example, and I know that Kendall McQuaid, who's been on the podcast previously, he's definitely, and he's been in discussion with Gabby quite a bit. He actually arranged a seminar, got her over here, and that was when I first sort of came across her research, and he's been in discussion ever since. And he's sort of been exploring and challenging the distal hypothesis, if you like, because his argument is that I think he's very much in a proximal space, and he's very, very focused on awareness of club head. So going back to what you said earlier on about the swing thought, often people's swing thoughts are based on bodily movement. And he feels that might, they're very temporary. Very often a swing thought will work for, a day or two or a round or two. And then all of a sudden it feels as if that same swing thought no longer works. I think this is often why his whole focus tends to be on developing an awareness of what the implement is doing. And by developing the awareness of the implement and your ability to manipulate the implement, having essentially that distal focus, then you then develop greater skill, because you are, in essentially, super dynamic scenario, which is not necessarily in golf reacting to an opponent, but certainly reacting to micro adjustments. So his argument is instead of most golfers where a shot goes wrong is because they make some kind of micro adjustment mid swing. The effort usually in most golfers is to try and create repeatability. Well, the argument is actually what you don't want is repeatability. What you want is a full awareness of variability, so that you can actually make micro corrective adjustments in mid swing if you need to, which is an interesting hypothesis that I've challenged him quite a lot. It would be a brilliant study to actually find a means by which to even kind of neurologically understand what's happening in that context. Very difficult to do. I just don't think we've got the equipment, and then we've got the field equipment that would enable us to do it. But if we could find a means by which to, at the very least, understand some of the underlying mechanisms about, kind of this micro adjustment hypothesis versus repeatability, if you like, or automaticity model, I'd be really interested to discover sort of that, because I think they would have so many applications in other domains.
Yeah, and again, this is why sport is a wonderful natural environment for learning about much broader topics, and golf certainly lends itself to a lot. I think the understanding and thinking about the club head is useful, because the argument goes, if I get the club head to do this, then as a natural consequence, the ball is going to do that, and I'll get the result that I want.
Yeah.
Now you can take one step back. If I get the body to do this, then the club head will do that, which will then cause the ball to do that.
Yes.
So there's levels at which you can think, and I think it's about at what level is the golfer most comfortable thinking, and moving up and down these levels depending on the situation, depending on the day. Darren Clark wrote an excellent book with Carl Morris about, and one of the bits in it was about thinking about different things, and your best days you could be thinking about nothing. You're just thinking about, all right, I need to swing the ball from left to right around that corner there, so I'm just thinking about swinging the ball from left to right, and away it goes. And that distal focus of attention might be appropriate, because in that situation you're really comfortable, controlled, and same way as driving, you don't think about all the steps in the way when you're driving. You think about where you want to go with the end product. Mm. You find yourself on a really tricky hill, doing a hill start with a really, really expensive Maserati behind you, really close. Suddenly you might start thinking a little bit more about some of the handbrake stuff. And it's a question of well, our mind naturally goes to different levels of control. What's the optimal level of control that you need for that skill? And I think sometimes it might be, you know what, it's a comfortable, it's an easy environment. Just think about the flight that you want the ball to take and make it happen. Or other times it might be, you know what, you need to think about how I want the club to move here. So I want to think about how the club head is going to connect with the turf and the ground, or sorry, the turf and the ball. Mm. And I want to think about that shallowness of that contact. Or I want to think about the movement that the club head is moving back here in the swing, which will set the rest up. Mm. So I think levels of control do depend on your level of comfort and skill at executing certain tasks. And there is some lovely stuff on how pressure interacts with that. Yeah. So pressure will always drag us down to closer and closer and closer to the body. Yeah. And so being aware of that and going with that, that's not necessarily a bad thing potentially, as long as you don't go too close.
What I love about watching Kendall at work is watching you mentioned like a bag of swing thoughts. Mm. He actually has a physical bag of implements that he's deliberately designed as a means by which to create different either equipment or task constraints. And so I mean, he's got a range of different clubs. Like he's got a very, very short driver that you can hit off a very, very high tee. He's got some heights. He's got a range of different things. He's got the tennis racket club. He's got the golf hammer. Whole range of things. He carries this bag around with him. It's like a box of tricks. What was really interesting though is one of the things he did with my son, you talk about ball turf contact. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people struggle with that in a golfing context, which is they think that the idea is to try and scoop the ball off the ground as an idea to lift the ball into the air, which often causes kind of difficult shots. Whereas the actual idea is to hit the ball and then to take some turf afterwards. And most people are learning golf in driving ranges on artificial mats where you don't really get that feeling because you only have to be slightly behind the ball. And the ball doesn't go anywhere on grass, but on a mat, you get away with it. So people aren't developing the proprioceptive understanding of where the ball needs to hit. But I noticed he used the mat that we were working on in the driving range, and he created a task constraint for my son using chalk. And he had red, amber, and green chalk, and placed the ball in different places, and then he would say, right, so I'm placing it on the amber. We don't want to see any red chalk. We don't want to see any amber chalk. We only want to see the green chalk on the bottom of the club once we play the shot. So he's that brilliant piece of feedback to Evan as he hit the ball, and he looks up at his club immediately to see if there's any amber or red on it, and has he got green, and he's getting a point if he's got green. And I just think these are lovely task constraints that, a bit like your plyometric box, that I love kind of discovering and exploring with in different sports contexts, because I think everyone's come up with these really fantastic creative constraints and this is one of the challenges I find is I look at that and go, that's such a great idea. And that's sometimes where I struggle around having the imagination to come up with the constraint that's going to create the movement change that we're looking for, or the tactical awareness, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and again, it's part of the whole adopting of this approach is just being brave and recognizing that, you know what, I'm going to try so many things that aren't going to work. Yeah. And the thing that I found, and I think that's it, you work, is not going to work tomorrow. And you just got to accept and run through that. But I'm just going to go back a step, because what you just talked about there with I love that red, amber, green chalk. And your son is 11?
He's just 10, yeah.
10. So he's engaging in deliberate practice there. Yeah. Highly focused, effortful. It's on the process. It's not about doing the thing. It's about getting better at this particular aspect to allow you to get better later. Yeah. All the classic definition of deliberate practice. And it should be, as a 10-year-old, he should be engaging in some highly structured, organized, specific deliberate practice, but only some. Yeah. That gives him the tool to go out and play better and to explore more when he's playing.
Yeah.
And I think it's the balance of integrating that in. Yes, of course, there's a place for this. It's about setting up, well, what is the little bit that you need to allow you to play a little bit better based on what you're currently doing. And again, I'm watching coaches because where I'm coaching at the moment, there's lots of other sports being coached around. So if I'm there early or late, I get to see some really interesting things. But I turned to my wife the last day. I said, I want you just to watch this. It was a Gaelic football match going on. I said, I just want you to watch this coach, because again, my long-suffering wife has no interest in anything to do with skill acquisition, but gets roped in now and again. And she can, as a result of a former mentor of mine, she can explain schema theory and variability hypothesis. So, but I just said, I want you to watch and what's your comment? And she came back with, he just wants to control, doesn't he? Because it was that classic video game. So he's shouting, run forward, run back, run left, kick it, long, hand pass, shoot, whatever the thing was. And I was looking at it going, I'm watching what's happening in the game. And I'm seeing that you've got a player there in the corner forward position. 3 times she's come out for the ball, and 3 times she's misread the pass in, or she's moving in the wrong place. So rather than shouting instructions as to what she's supposed to do, there's a mark on the piece of paper that goes, over the next couple of weeks, that's the situation that girl needs to find herself in. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm watching, and the game is a means to gather information.
Yep.
Because again, your mind can only do so much. He's missed all of that.
Yeah.
He certainly can't accurately recall that afterwards. We know that from studies. So by trying to control, he's actually missing the keys to their future development, which should be guiding the next however many weeks practices.
Yeah.
And so that's, I kind of link it back to, you got to design practice, which is based on what they need. So that deliberate practice that your son was engaging in is fantastic, especially if that's exactly what he needs as the next step. It's solving some kind of a problem that he has in the games that he's playing.
Yeah.
So what's going to make you better? And again, I've absolutely no problem with, asking kids that question. What's going to make you better at sprinting or whatever, even if they're 11, 12, 13 years of age? Yeah. It's not as serious, in-depth adult conversation, but it's a little bit about giving them ownership and straight away involving them in the process, because this is your experience, this is your journey.
Yeah.
So, and if somebody comes back and says, I don't know what to do, which you will get a lot early on in the process, that's fine. Let's figure it out. But here's my expectation from day one: you're going to be taking a hand in doing this.
There's so much in that. I mean, the only area where I think he's so I think you're right. He is involved in deliberate practice, with the exception of the definition of deliberate practice being that it's not necessarily fun. It was definitely fun. He was enjoying every moment of it.
But again, when you look at the early studies of deliberate practice in sport, that's the bit that didn't come across from music.
Yeah.
And again, so my background is in track and field, which is one step up from sadomasochism. It is just there ain't a whole lot of fun in running based activities, and there's a danger. Sorry, there can be, but there's a real danger because it's much easier to have fun in ball games, invasion sports. It lends itself to more playful activities much more. I think you've got to be much more creative to develop a sense of team and to engage in fun practice. It's too easy in track and field, I think, and in swimming and those kind of sports, to just take the adult model and water it down slightly for children. And I think we need to be much more creative as to what, again, for me, what track and field looks like. So it's a child version of track and field. The less it looks like the adult version, the happier I am.
I agree, and I think this is definitely a subject for a future podcast, because I know that you've got a lot of very interesting stuff to share with the world around the whole track and field environment. Interestingly, and I couldn't agree with you more, by the way, I feel like I think this is where Amanda Vissek's fun integration theory is so valuable, because of the way she's kind of almost like calibrated what fun looks like. It is, and even to for kids, it's not necessarily just frivolous and playful. They actually derive a great deal of fun from task accomplishment, from being dedicated to something, being committed to something, being part of a group sometimes, not always, but being part of a group and social interaction is important. And so actually, like you say, even in a running context, or in any other context, like you say, in training for the 800 is hard work, and pretty challenging. But I think a lot of people derive enjoyment from that because of the sense of accomplishment they achieve and the sense of progression they're making. And with that context as well, one of the ways that which everyone was deriving fun was because, he was able to very easily kind of understand, whether he was achieving, because he had this visual reference point that gave him the feedback. Whereas previously, he was hitting the ball on the mat, all sorts of different, and didn't really understand what the difference was. And what he was able to do with the help of Kendall was to be able to go, right, I've got green. Okay, what do you think you did differently there with the club that helped you to get green? And so then there's that learning, and he's then in charge of understanding why he gets this contact and why he doesn't get the contact. And I find it's quite an interesting thing for me. He did another task as well, which was really just fascinating, which was to get a golf tee in the ground, hit it with a club so that it pops up in the air and you can catch it. I've never seen two children, and my daughter's only 6, never seen two children more absorbed in a task than just trying to catch a tee. It wouldn't leave. I'm like, we've got to go home. It's dinner time. No, Dad, I'm not going until I've done it. And honestly, it was just fascinating. But again, this understanding the feedback process. And I say understanding what fun looks like in different contexts, and understanding the child's perspective. Yeah. And not making assumptions. Yeah. Because the assumption can literally be, this isn't frivolous enough. Yeah. But this is too serious. Actually, that might not be the child's perspective. Now, we do need to guard against that. Yeah. Because a child can think, if you offer them a choice between spinach and ice cream as a bowl to go with their dinner, I'm pretty sure I can guess which one they'd choose. Yeah. So they might not always choose appropriately, or they might end up spending too long in activities. So there needs to be a little bit of guardianship over it. But on the whole, absolutely, we've got to, the more, I find this with students, and I find this with in university, the way I work with them, and with athletes and young people as well. The more you gamble on them being able to do something, the more you take a chance with them, the more they reward you. The more I kind of get back, and I think, I was underestimating you guys. This is fantastic. And so I think I'm always looking for ways to just push and go, if I'm thinking, is this too much? I'm probably going to be okay, because constantly students and athletes, they surprise me, and they make me think, I haven't thought you capable enough. You really are doing some outstanding things. The bigger fear should be it's not stretching enough, shouldn't it? Yeah. Right. So I'm very conscious that talking about all this sport and everything else, I'm going to watch my youngsters participate in the school sports day, a high quality athletic endeavour if I've ever seen one. And as we were saying before we recorded this podcast, thankfully for me, there is no dad's race. Otherwise, I would have been compelled to participate, but at the same time would have demonstrated my lack of athletic prowess for all to see in all too public a way. So I do have to head off to that. But I've massively enjoyed the conversation, Phil, and I really appreciate you being able to. It's really enjoyable. Great. Well, like I said, the feeling is entirely mutual. I've learned an awful lot, which is fantastic as well. I would definitely like later on in the year, if you're willing as well, to do a kind of a part 2, because I know there's definitely some stuff we need to talk about around your work in athletics. In the meantime, I know you are pretty active on social media, and so if people are kind of interested in following you and finding out a bit more about the stuff that you're researching and sharing, I mean, I do get loads of stuff from you that I think, oh well, that's really interesting, and I quite often share it myself. How do they find you? Well, on Twitter at Kearney_Phil is a good place to start.
or you can just drop me an email. It's philip.kearney@ul.ie. I do a search and you should be able to find me fairly lively. But yeah, very happy always to interact on Twitter or through emails. And it's fantastic. So, most of the stuff that I get from coaches in terms of commentary, it goes straight back as examples for the students in terms of, here are some questions that I've gotten. What would you say about this? So it's a really valuable source for me, this interaction. It's anything that's mutually beneficial. I think we need to harvest more of.
Brilliant stuff. I like to think of it, like I said, I was having a debate earlier on today, and I like to think of it as almost like, from a researcher's perspective, it's almost like field notes coming back in that can be, and I sort of feel like there's a piece of work to be done there about more of us out there as practitioners sharing our field notes for the researchers. Because I know, just going off the point slightly, but Rob Gray, when he came on and he spoke to some members of the conclave, which we put out as a podcast, he actually subsequently went away, I think, and then did a further podcast exploring the research areas around one of the questions that one of the coaches had posed. And so, I think from a researcher's perspective, actually, it's the questions or the problems that the coaches are trying to solve that actually should be some of our more interesting research questions.
Well, I think that's what's been really nice coming back into Ireland. So got involved a little bit with Athletics Ireland, but even just, I've met swimming coaches, I've met various different individuals since I've been back, and it's all been a case of, okay, let's try and build a little bit of a skill acquisition community here, which is a community in the sense that we are coaches, researchers, coach educators, all communicating and interacting and finding mutually interesting questions. So, there are things I want to know, and there's things that athletics clubs and coaches want to know. Okay, if they line up, that's what we're going to do. We're going to find those things that line up. And definitely when you talk to people, there are mutual interests there. So I'm really keen to, it's a marker for me of I'll be successful in the next year if I do get that more interactions with different community groups and the research problems being aligned with what they're coming out with.
Awesome. Phil, really appreciate you coming on. All the best for this summer. Hope you have a good break, and then we'll speak again later in the year.
Just say one last thing very quickly, just as a one last movie reference. We had the Blues Brothers at the start. So I do a couple of kind of introductory slides, skill acquisition, how do you find out more? And so if I only have one or two sessions, I've got a slide at the end from the Matrix. So this is your option to take the red pill, which is to leave the Matrix, and then it's a couple of textbooks to read. It's a very good blog, and there's a couple of podcasts, and you're in there, so you are that red pill in the Matrix in terms of a way for people to get an enormous amount of really valuable information. So really appreciate the stuff that you're doing. It's fantastic.
Well, Phil, I'm what's the word? I'm massively grateful for you saying that. This has been a very interesting journey. I definitely did take. I think it was the blue pill. Red pill or blue pill? Which pill was it? I'm definitely in there though.
Whichever that one, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm loving it, and I'm loving these kinds of conversations. Like I said, I learn an awful lot from them. So if I wasn't putting them out there into the world, I would definitely be just seeking them out anyway. So thank you for being part of that. And all the best.
All the best. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.